Welcome back, guys. We're going to go ahead and get started. Two things before we start. Number one, make sure you're aware that I posted the quiz, last week's quiz. You should have got a link to that. You want to look on Canvas. I believe it's due tonight at midnight. And then this lecture is actually a makeup lecture for last week. This will be Friday's lecture. So what I've done is I recorded the lecture we would have had today. Basically, it's just a PowerPoint presentation. So I recorded it using a screen recorder, and I'm going to post two videos. I'll post this one, and I'll post the one that should have been today. So we won't meet live for probably the PowerPoints. I'll just pre-record and you guys can watch them. Some of those PowerPoints will require interaction between us, so I'll let you know if it's something that you need to stream live, or if it's something you can just watch at your own, your own leisure. So make sure we got some catch-up work to do. By Wednesday, you want to make sure you view the lecture that I posted for today, which is just a PowerPoint presentation. Actually, there's two PowerPoint presentations. So getting back to the discussion from last class, just kind of an overview. We talked about two quantities, analog and digital quantities. Most quantities that we would measure in nature, most quantities that we want to measure with the PL to go into a PLC to use to do some kind of automation. Most quantities you would want to go into a computer or any digital device, those quantities are going to be analog. The problem is digital devices, and from now on I'm going to refer to those devices as machines. Machines do not understand analog. Machines can only understand digital. So we end up going through a process, going from analog to digital. That's a process. And basically we end up with storing or transferring analog information into a digital code. A digital code is represented in binary, and binary uses digits 0 and 1. We referred to last class as the 0 or 1, we call them a bit. And a bit is just, they took the B from the word binary and the IT from the word digit. A binary digit is called a bit. A bit can be a 0 or a 1. So one question to ask is, how are bits represented in a machine? And we kind of touched on this in the last video, but I want to go into a little bit more. So how are bits represented in a machine? And the answer is we use two-state electronics. And two-state electronics is a way of thinking where we have not an infinite number of values for amplitude, for voltage, or current. We just have two. Any two of our choosing, but we have two values. And the one value, the high value, we call a high, and the lower voltage or value, we call a low. So we're going to use, to represent a binary 1, 5 volts. And to represent a binary 0, 0 volts. So what I could have is maybe a code. Maybe I have 1, 0, 0, 1. So that's my binary code. But in the machine, maybe I could have these tiny microscopic capacitors. If you remember, a capacitor is a device that holds a charge. You can charge a capacitor up, you can discharge it. So maybe I have a little tiny capacitor in here, maybe 4 little tiny capacitors. And that first one on the left, maybe I charge that one up to 5 volts, and to that machine that would represent a 1. And there's 0 volts, 0 volts, 5 volts. And so what actually is stored or inside the machine are voltage levels, because as I said before, digital devices do not understand zeros and ones. All we can do with electrical devices is give them voltage or current. So ultimately, we're dealing with the presence or absence of a voltage. Another way they used to do this, or you could do it, is you take a device called a donut, which is just a little tiny circular, it's like a washer, really tiny washer, and we can magnetize these in a certain direction. You know, there are magnetic poles north and south, so we could maybe magnetize this one where the flux lines are that way to represent a 1, and maybe magnetize this one to where the flux lines are the other way to represent a 0. So any way that you can represent a quantity using two things, true or false, 5 volts, 0 volts, a magnetic field polarized to the left or to the right, you can use that to represent binary information. And this is actually the way memory used to work years ago, probably around the 70s and the late 70s. This was called core memory. It was magnetic, and they had millions of little tiny donuts where they can magnetize these, and the magnetic field would have a certain direction. And depending on the direction of the magnetic field, that would represent a 1 or 0 in memory. And they actually still use the capacitors to. This is called, if you're computer literate, this is called dynamic. I forgot my A in there. Dynamic memory. This is dynamic memory. Dynamic memory because these capacitors are really tiny. Capacitors actually, even though they store a charge, they won't store a charge forever. There's a little leakage current in the capacitor, and over time, any and all capacitors will discharge. Well, these capacitors are so small, they discharge rather quickly. So this type of memory, dynamic memory, has to be refreshed every so often, maybe every couple milliseconds, which might seem like a lot, but to electrical current, a millisecond is like a year. So this is actually still used, the capacitors. But notice here, we're storing these values. We're storing zeros or storing ones, either electrically or magnetically. So I want to talk about, okay, once we get these zeros and ones stored, they can't stay in one place. We got to be able to move them around. So how do we move digital information? Before I get into how we move digital information, I want to talk one more thing about this level of 5 volts or 0 volts. Well, this value right here is actually an ideal value. So these are ideal. So in the perfect world, two-state electronics, we like for exactly 5 volts to represent a binary 1, 0 volts to represent a binary 0, but that's not what happens. In the real world, we deal with ranges. So these are practical levels. And you might have something like this. Instead of having exactly 5, let's say you have 0 volts here, and up here, 5 volts. So the 0 volts represents, of course, a binary 1, and we call this a low. I said 1, but this represents a 0, and the 5 volts represents a 1, so that's a high. But the point I want to make is actually there's a range. There's not just exactly 5 or exactly 0. This might go all the way down the, this range might go all the way down to, let's say, 2 volts. And this range right here might go all the way up to, let's say that's 0.8 volts. And so what really happens in these circuits is anything in this range right here, the machine will consider a high or a 1. Anything in this range, the machine will consider a 0. So exactly 5 and 0. Now, I know if you're in the classroom and somebody, you can raise your hand and ask me a question. Your question should be, all right, Singleton, okay, what happens if something's in between here? And the answer is, you're not allowed to have anything there. This is called the forbidden zone. It's actually called the forbidden zone. And you say, all right, Singleton, we might, maybe we're not allowed to have, but what if there is a value there? And the answer to the question is, if their value falls here in this forbidden zone, in that range, then the results are unpredictable. And so we do everything in our power to keep the values within the specified ranges here. And this 5 and 2 and 0.8 and 0 are just for examples. This is actually a class of devices called, based on a family of logic called TTL. You don't have to get into that, but So you don't have to take these as gospel. We're going to use the ideal values over here, 5 and 0, to represent 1 and 0 binary. But I just want you to understand that in the real world, we actually deal with ranges. Okay, so next question is, this is how we run the bit. We can have a bunch of these bits together, and that the bits together represent either a code or a number, and that code or number represents information, maybe from an analog signal, maybe it's a color, part of a color for a pixel on the screen. It represents some kind of information. But how are these bits moved around? How do we move a 1 or a 0 from one place to another, say in your cell phone or in a computer? How do we move bits? Well, to answer that, we got to talk about something called a pulse. A pulse. So I want to describe for you a digital pulse. All right, so a digital pulse, I'm going to draw 2 of them. Okay, so that's a digital pulse. We call this a positive going pulse. And then over here, here's a negative going pulse. Now, on the positive going pulse, down here, this level right here, the baseline, and at the baseline that represents 0 volts, and then here 5 volts, and of course the height of this, we call that the amplitude. So the amplitude for us is 5 volts. I have these times right here. I'm going to put a dot right here and call this T0, and here call that T1. And so on the bottom, if you imagine an axis here, a horizontal axis, we got time on that axis, on the horizontal axis. In here, I can measure from this point to this point. I'm going to call that T sub W. T sub W, from there to there. And that's called the pulse width. The pulse width. Now, if you look at this pulse, if you imagine this sitting on top of a Cartesian coordinate system, right at the origin, that dot is at the origin, you know T0 happens first in time. So even though if you think of this thing as moving, it looks like this end is going to get there first. In time, in TIME time, this side happens first. So this voltage level starts out at 0 volts. It goes up to, in this case, 5 volts. It stays high for a certain amount of time, the time of the pulse width, and then it goes back down to 0 volts. That's a positive going pulse. This is the leading edge. This is the trailing edge. Or some books will say this is the rising edge. This is the falling edge. And here, again, T0 will be here. T1 will be here. This happens first in time. And here we start off at a high. We go low. We stay low for the pulse width, T sub W, and then we go back up to 5 volts. That's our negative going pulse. Now, if you look at this, we have an issue, though, a problem. This is actually an ideal pulse. This is ideal. And I say that because, well, look at right here at T0. How long does it take to go from 0 volts up to 5, according to the picture I drew here? It takes no time at all. It's instantaneous, and as you know, that can't be. So I'm going to draw an actual pulse, or one that approximates an actual pulse. We'll talk about that real quick. So in reality, it takes time to go from 0 volts up to 5. So that pulse here, which is almost a perfect square wave, is the way we like to think about it. The pulse actually looks more like this. It's more spread out. So instead of a square wave, you have something more like that. Now, everything I'm talking about here, make sure you look at the class website. If you go through and look at all the links, you'll see everything I'm talking about. There's the pictures that I have on the website are better than the one I'm drawing on the board for you. So listen to what I'm saying, look at the video, rewatch it, but make sure you go look at the stuff I put up on the website and look at the pictures and understand what's going on. So in reality, the point is that this can't happen. We can't go from T0, we can't go from 0 volts to 5 volts instantaneously. It actually takes time to go from the baseline up to the top of the amplitude. And we have another problem is if I want to make some measurements in here, the part right here and right here, and then these corners, they're actually kind of rounded. So these are non-linear regions. And so what we do when we want to make measurements, we try to go beyond, we go about 10% up from the baseline, and we take a value there. So we go 10% up from the baseline, and we go 10% down from the amplitude. And then we take our measurements there. And the kind of measurements I might want to take, well, I can, this right here might be a little time T0, and this right here might be a little time T1. So that the difference between these, that little delta T, we call that the rise time. So I'm going to subscript that with the R. I don't know if you can see that in the camera, but that's T sub R. That little delta T there represents how much time it takes to go from a low to a high. We call that the rise time, and I can repeat that over here if I wanted to and get the fall time. Now, in some cases, if you were dealing with, if you're actually designing computers or digital devices, you would be concerned about stuff like this because you can't have actions in the machine that's faster than the rise or fall time of the digital pulse. So that would be an issue, but not for us in this class because we won't deal with things of that nature. But I just want you to see that we're dealing with ideal values, and in reality, here's what we're dealing with. It gets a little bit more complicated, so we're kind of simplifying things. All right. So I have this pulse, and what I can do now with these pulses, a group of pulses, a group of positive going pulses and negative going pulses, a group of pulses is called a signal. Now, I'm writing this out, but if you're taking notes, a digital signal. So once I take these pulses and put them together, I have a digital signal, and that's how we move bits. So let me show you what I mean by that, a digital signal. What we call a waveform, a signal or waveform. Now, there's two types of waveforms I want to talk about that are important. There's periodic waveforms, and non-periodic waveforms. And both of these are important. So a periodic waveform is one that repeats at regular intervals. So it might look like this. So there's a periodic waveform. It repeats at regular intervals. And make sure you understand what's repeating. It's not this part right here that's repeating. The repetition happens right here. It starts here, goes up, over, down, and then it repeats right here. So this is what's repeating, this thing right here. That's one. And then it does that again and then again. So that is a periodic waveform. And the other waveform is a non-periodic waveform. It might look something like this. That's a non-periodic waveform. The periodic waveform has two things that are important that we want to talk about: frequency and period. Frequency and period. So frequency that's how often. How often in a second, the time space of 1 second, how often does this thing repeat itself? And in period, how long? How often and how long? How long does it take for one repetition? So frequency and period are important for a periodic waveform. And there's a relationship that you want to make sure you probably already know it from physics or something, but these two are related. Period equals 1 over frequency. And so for period, I use this T, this capital T, and I'll put these little sidebars on the T. So T is 1 on F and vice versa. The unit for this right here, the unit for frequency is 1 over seconds. So the unit for that is an inverse second. So if I have 1 over S, then I get seconds for this, which is what it should be. Now, so the unit for frequency is an inverse second. The unit for period is seconds. But what we do for frequency, 1 inverse second, we represent that as a unit called a hertz. That's a capital HZ, hertz. So if I have something like I don't know, let's say I have a frequency of 1,000 hertz. I can call that, if I wanted to, 1 kilohertz. 1 kilohertz. And I want to know the period is 1 over 1,000. 1 over 1,000 inverse seconds or hertz. So that's 0.001 seconds. And so that would be 1 millisecond. So that's the kind of calculation you got to be able to do, which is pretty simple. Now think on the next quiz. Quiz 1 should be pretty easy when you guys look at it, if you haven't already looked at it. Quiz 2, I'll have some of this stuff on where you have to calculate and use formulas, so make sure you're aware of it. Of course, you'll be doing it at home, so you'll have everything right there, so that shouldn't be an issue. Now, This actually gets to be important when we talk about periodic and non-periodic signals, because what happens is this. Remember, what we're trying to do is we're trying to move bits. We can store bits in a capacitor using a magnetic memory. There's a lot of ways to store digital information. That's one problem solved. But once we have it stored, how do we move it from one area to another? Like, how do we move it from, let's say, the computer to the printer? Inside the computer, from memory to the microprocessor, or vice versa. How do we do that? So we're trying to answer that question. So to answer that question, we got to have both of these signal types. We got to have periodic signals and non-periodic signals. And I want to tell you what these are used for. The non-periodic signals are used to carry information. Basically they carry bits. They carry the binary digits. And this is used for something we call clocking. Clocking. So in every digital device, anything that we consider a computer, these machines that we're talking about, there's always a special circuit called a clock that puts out a periodic signal. And whatever device you're using, nothing can happen until the clock starts to tick. This is actually the heart of any digital system, the clock. When you talk about a computer, you buy a computer and you say, well, how fast is that processor? And I don't know what they're up to, probably, several gigahertz. When we talk about, I have a 10 gigahertz processor, what are you talking about? You're talking about the clock speed. That microprocessor can't go any faster than the clock because it's the clock making the thing tick, making the microprocessor move and do what it does. So it can't handle any instructions faster than the clock. This is literally the heart of any digital machine. All right, so looking at this, my zeros and ones are here. I take a bunch of, we take positive going pulses and negative going pulses, and they can represent zeros and ones, and then we can move those waveforms back and forth across the wire. And so I actually carry zeros and ones right here. But if you're looking at this and you're thinking about it, you should see a problem that's just jumping out at you. And the problem is, okay, I can kind of see what you're saying. This right here represents a high, and this area here represents a low. This could be a 1. Maybe this is a 1. Obviously, that would be a 0, and that might be a 1. But how do you know that's not 2 1s? Or how do you know that's not 2 zeros or 3 1s? How do you know that? And the answer is, well, that's where the clocking comes in. What you want to do is look at the period of the clock. So the period is measured from where it starts to where it ends. Remember, the thing that's repeating is this. Right? So that's this. And then it starts over again. That's what's repeating. So the width of that in time, this width in time from this point to that point, that width, that's what we mean by period. We say period means how long for one repetition. Well, that's how long in time right there. So when we deal with periodic signals, the period of a periodic signal, and this applies to the clock, and the clock only, the period of the periodic signal produced by a clock, a clocking circuit, the period, we call that the bit time. The bit time. The bit time is just what it says, the time for one bit. So once you have the clock waveform, periodic waveform for the clock, and then you have the digital information being transferred, say in this waveform right here, what you can do is just, you can clock it like this. So the period starts here. And then here. And I kind of drew these off a little bit, so I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to make this fit, because I drew this freehand. But you can see what I'm after here, where I'm going with this. I hope you can, that now with the bit time, I can see that this represents a 1, that represents a 0. This should be moved over. That's why I want you guys to look at this on the actual website, because everything is lined up and neat, and I didn't draw it with a ruler. But basically you can define, if I have one long signal like this, if I gave you something like this, one long signal like that, and I say, all right, well, how many ones? I can see that's a 1 and these are zeros. Well, how many ones is that? What you do is you just break this up using the bit time. So that's a 1, that's a 1, and that's a 0. So that waveform is carrying 2 1s and a 0. Okay. So we represent digital information using bits, 1s or 0s. We store those bits using voltages. High represents here a 1, a low is a 0. But really we know in those machines, the high is represented with the voltage. For us, it's going to be 5 volts. The low is represented with a voltage. For us, it's going to be 0 volts. And we can store those some kind of way using any means where we can have one or another of a value of 5 volts and 0 volts, or a magnetic field with opposing magnetic polarity. Some kind of way we have to be able to represent 2 opposing or 2 different things. And now we're saying, all right, to move these bits around, we use these waveforms. So once these waveforms are moving, say down the wire, if I move this digital information, all I have is a voltage that goes high, that stays high for a certain amount of time at 5 volts and goes back low. But we know how many 1s that is because we know the bit time. So we can figure out how many 1s and 0s we're actually transmitting. So, okay, once I got these stored bits into a waveform and then moving down the wire, when they get to the other end of the wire, how do we capture those bits? How do we capture the bits? Well, to answer that, I want to talk about another device, or a device called a register. And it's actually called a shift register. So if you want to write this down, it's a shift register. We call the register for short. So we use these registers to capture the bits. Now, a register is an actual device that you can go to. Well, I don't know where you would go to now. You get it online, but a long time ago it was this place called Radio Shack. I don't think they're still around. It closed down. But you used to be able to go buy electrical parts. So if you were a hobbyist or you were a geek, electrical geek, you can go buy capacitors, relay, whatever you want, and you can put stuff together. You could actually go to Radio Shack if you're going to build a computer from scratch, and you could buy a shift register. Now when people build computers, they really don't build computers. All you do is you go buy a motherboard, and you go buy memory. You buy the boards and you snap it together. To me, that's not building anything. I'm not trying to take anything away from you, but building a computer is what Steve Jobs and his partner did. They built it from scratch. I mean, they took chips, resistors, they took this stuff, they actually put it together on the board. So you can actually go and buy a shift register and put it on the board and use that to capture these 1s and 0s in the digital waveforms. So I want to talk about a register. Now, registers are actually devices. You can size them. They have a lot of parameters. If you're getting into this, you could really do a whole couple classes on just shift registers. So I want to really simplify it, and we're going to think of a shift register as just a group of cells together, a group of cells. So right here is a register, and I have these cells. So this is a shift register. I have these cells, and what I have is I have a line that goes in, that's my input, and a line that comes out. Now I'm going to draw this a couple times. Now, the way I'm drawing this, again, I'm simplifying this. You probably won't have a shift register with 4 cells. A shift register will have many, many, many cells. But the smallest number you likely have would be 8. And I'm not sure you can buy a shift register that small, but it would have to be something that 1 bit you can't really do much with. You need at least 8 bits to make sense out of stuff, unless you're using a PLC. The PLC is the only digital device I'm aware of where say it's bit oriented. So with a PLC, a 1 or a 0 could mean a switch is open or closed, but in your computer, cell phone, or whatever device you're using, they group it into groups of 8 bits called a byte, and we'll talk about bytes next week, so don't worry about that right now. But let's say I have this binary number, 1, 0, 1, 1, and I want to store that in the shift register. What happens is, remember, everything happens according to the clock. So nothing's going to go faster than the clock. So if I draw the clock, and I talk about a click of the clock, that's basically a bit time. So let's say from here to here, and that bit time, what will happen is this 1 will move into the shift register. So I'm going to label this A, B, C, and D, like that. So when that first pulse of the clock goes, it's going to move. This thing's going to shift over, and this 1, this is 1 with a D on it, that's going to move in the shift register. And then on the next click of the clock, this 1's going to move over, so that's 1D, and that 1's going to move in there, so we got 1C. And then on the next click of the clock, you can see what's going to happen. This is going to move over, so I got 1D here, I got 1C here, B is a 0, so 0B, and then on the last click of the clock, this moves over, so I got 1D there, I got the 1C there, I got 0B, and I got 1A, and now my shift register is loaded. It took 4 clicks of the It took 4 clock clicks to get that those 4 bits into the shift register. So let's say my bit time was I don't know. Let's just make it easy. Let's say my bit time here was 1 millisecond. To load that shift register with those 4 bits, it will take 4 clicks of the clock. 4 clicks will take 4 milliseconds. And to you, I know a millisecond seems like a really long time, but to a computer, a millisecond is a long time. That is really, really, really slow. This type of shift register is called a serial in, serial out. So basically, I started off like this, and I have 1 line in, 1 line out. So if I want to get this out of the shift register will hold it. If I want to move it somewhere else in my digital circuitry, it's going to take 4 more clicks of the clock to get these to move over and come out. Serial in, serial out. You want to recognize that. If seeing this, you want to know that I'm talking about serial in, serial out. There's really no reason, though, why we can't do this. I might have this. I might have 1 line in like this, and instead of having 1 line out, maybe I got outputs like this. I got 4 outputs. So to load this shift register, again, it would take 4 clock clicks, right? It would take 4. But then when I load it with this, after 4 milliseconds, according to what I have here, 1, 0, 1, 1. But when I want to read it, that's called a write when you load it. If I want to read it, want to get this out, it won't take 1 click of the clock because everything is in parallel. Everything comes out together. So that will come out and will take only 1 millisecond. This would be serial in, parallel out. And again, on a quiz or test, you want to know I have a 1 line in, 1 line out. serial in, serial out, one line in, several lines out, serial in, parallel out, and of course, to finish this, of course, we could have this. There's no reason why I couldn't design a chip or device this way. Where I have several lines coming in and several lines coming out. Now, if I had this number here, I'd have a 1, 0, 1, 1 sitting there, and then one click of the clock, it'll load. And if I want it out, want to read it, one click of the clock, it'll unload. So this is, of course, really fast. So if I look at the extreme, on one end, I have this as a shift register. This is serial in, serial out. This is very, very, very slow, but it's cheap and it's simple. This is extremely fast, but it's complicated and it's expensive. So it depends on what you're doing. Actually, where they use these, it just depends. I think there's an example I'll put on Blackboard where I have let's say I have a computer. Maybe I have a digital device, a computer. Or whatever. And over here I have a printer. I don't know how to draw a printer. This is a printer. Now, most printers nowadays, they'll connect using some kind of wireless protocol, or they'll use a cable called the USB cable. But back in the day, they had something called a serial port. Some people call it a printer port, but it was a serial port. Serial port. The reason it was called a serial port is there literally was one line going over to the printer. And if I had a document here, say this is my Word document, and I know, let's say I'm going to spell my name, R-O-N, Ron. Well, the R, the O, and the N is not what moves. You know that these are all, any information, letters, numbers, whatever, is represented as zeros and ones. So that R is represented by so many zeros and ones. It's a series of 8 of them. And the O, 8 zeros and ones. There's some combination. This is called ASCII code. I mentioned that before, ASCII. We'll get into that later. The point is that these pulses are come here, and just bit by bit, I'm going, maybe this is a couple ones, a zero, and that's a couple ones. I'm going to send information to that printer bit by bit by bit. This is really slow. But in the case like this, it doesn't matter, because usually the printer is just sitting there anyway. So you're working over here on the computer, you hit print. This process is slow. And by slow, I mean it might take milliseconds, which means it's slow to hear you. But for a digital device, that is like a year. A millisecond, electrons are sitting around like this, they're bored. This is a long time. So it might be milliseconds, but that in the electrical world, that's really slow. But that's okay, because as I said, the printer's just sitting there. You're over here working. These things can load up and take time to print. The circuitry was just way cheaper if we just did it in a serial fashion. In some cases in digital devices, we got to have the speed. An example of that is you're actually working inside the computer. Inside of the computer, the CPU, the central processing unit, you know you have the microprocessor. So let's say we're inside of this thing now, and I have the microprocessor here. So micro symbol and P, microprocessor. So here's my microprocessor, and maybe here's some memory. This is called RAM. Random access memory we'll talk about later. But the point is, I want to move information between the microprocessor and the RAM memory. And this won't work. This is just entirely too slow. So you might have actually 8 lines. Why? Well, 8 because the smallest piece of information pretty much every digital machine manipulates is a group of 8 bits called a byte. Again, this is not true of the PLC. PLCs actually manipulate bits, and we'll talk about that in some detail. But everything else in the digital world is bytes. You talk about kilobytes, megabytes, it's bytes, a group of 8 bits. So somebody asked, when was it? Friday, somebody stayed after and asked a really good question. I don't remember exactly how they framed the question, but basically, the bit number, the number of bits that we deal with, does that have any kind of effect on the way we design the machine? And yes, it does. If I want this microprocessor to move information really fast, I don't want any 8 lines going in that microprocessor, and then we can move a byte at a time at a really high rate. But even that's slow. But my point is, if I want to transfer information between memory and the microprocessor, you definitely want to do that. You want to do that in parallel. So this will be, if I was going between 2 registers, a parallel in, parallel out type situation. So again, I have this example on not Blackboard, but Canvas. You can look at that. The pictures are nicer. Everything's cleaner, and then you'll understand that. I also have a couple examples. This was one of the examples. But another example that I have on Canvas of digital systems. So I'm probably going to run out of time. I wanted to work that practice problem, but I want to keep going. You guys, if you need to sign off at 2, go ahead and sign off, and I want to keep going with the practice problem. I'm looking over there at the machine. I should be looking at you in the camera. You can sign off at 2 if you got another class or you got something to do. And then you can look at the video when I post it to YouTube. But I want you to work that example problem. But I do want to show you this because I want to give you extra credit. I'm going to start giving you more extra credit. So one of the examples I have on Canvas is an example of an analog system. And it's just a regular PA system. So a PA system, what you have is you have basically an amplifier. They call it a linear amplifier on the example. It's just an amplifier. You know, amplifiers make things louder. Basically, the amplifier, hooked to the amplifier, I got a microphone. And let's say I have a signal going into the microphone like that. Well, on the other side of the amplifier, I have a speaker. And what I get out is an exact duplicate or copy or analog. Analog also means copy. I get an analog or copy of that, only it's made bigger and more powerful. So if I was to draw this bigger, it might be something like that. That's an example of an analog system. Well, a digital system might look like this. Now you guys, I'm really dating myself. A CD is what I want to talk about, a CD. So a compact disc. So I got a CD, and they don't use CDs anymore. Everything's to a flash drive or you download it. But if you know, you guys are young enough to know what a CD is. So there's a CD, and on that CD is digital bits. There's bits of information. There's bits, binary information on there. And so what they got to do is, if I have a CD with music on it, obviously sound is analog. So how am I going to use this system if I digitize the sound? Well, in this system, what I would have is a device first called a DAC. And I would feed the zeros and ones to the DAC. A DAC, digital to analog converter. Digital to analog converter. So I got my ones and zeros on here. They're transferred to the DAC. And over here, this kind of goes the opposite way. On the couple lectures ago, I talked about how to go from analog to digital. A more interesting process is how you go back from digital to analog. Because what this does, I can have an analog to digital converter, which is what I explained a couple lectures ago. But this goes the other way, a digital to analog converter. So we'll change these zeros and ones back to an analog signal, which I would then feed to my speaker and sound out. The advantage of doing it this way is what I said before. Example number one, the digital advantage. I can make a copy of a copy of a copy. You can make a trillion copies of a CD, and the original and the trillionth with the TH copy on it sound exactly alike, pretty much. And I don't know. I know I mentioned cassette tapes, and I don't know if you guys probably know what a cassette tape is. But cassette tapes were sized by minutes. You could buy a 15-minute tape. You could buy a 30-minute tape. You could buy I think a 60 and a 90. They didn't go much above 90 because the physical size of the tape was set. And as the tape got longer, they had to make the tape thinner. So a 90-minute tape, the material was way thinner than, let's say, a 15-minute, and it would break often. So they couldn't go much beyond that. So in 90 minutes, you can only have so many songs, especially the old school songs, because they were way longer than what you guys listen to. Well, here, how many songs can you put on the CD? You can really put a lot of stuff on there because we can compress information. Again, the digital advantage. So these are two examples that I have on Canvas, and you can look at those and again, just kind of review, and this will help reinforce some of the ideas that we've been talking about.
What about vinyl?
Say it again.
What about vinyl?
Oh man, now you trying to get me started on this music stuff, and vinyl. That is really interesting. I love vinyl, the sound, the feel of vinyl. So vinyl, the way that works is there's he's talking about, I guess you guys know, but the vinyl, it has a little grooves in it, and it's like a little spindle like this. Right? And the music is actually stored. They have these little irregularities in the grooves. These little tiny irregularities that actually represent sound. And it's actually analog, it's not digitized. So the needle, when you put a needle here, will actually ride on these little bitty pits and valleys, and that would cause it's called a piezo sensor. This sensor, when you vibrate it, it can produce electric pulse or voltage or currents, probably more correct to say a voltage, and it will be in sync with those pits, which represent music. Records were really limited. I mean, I'm old enough to remember going to the record store and actually buying vinyl records. Well, of course, you prefer a tape because they were smaller, and you couldn't have a record in your car. You want to ride around with your top down with your tape, with your music playing. You couldn't do that with vinyl. But that is actually different than this. This is stored still in an analog fashion. Now, since you brought that up, what I want for the extra credit, because the way that the information is stored here is actually, if you could see this in a microscope, there's actually little irregularities in the grooves. And maybe a loud noise or slap would be like that, and this needle would ride up and down over this and cause it to vibrate and produce a voltage directly proportional to this, and then we'll amplify the voltage. Well, that's not what's going on over here. So here's an extra credit if you want to do it. Now remember, the extra credit are worth 2%, which might not seem like a lot, but towards the end, I guarantee you, when I'm grading, there's always somebody sitting at 78.999 or 79 point whatever. And I always say, Singleton, there's something I can do to get me over there. That's what I put. This is the first time in my life I've ever given extra credit. So I highly advise do it because they're simple and they'll probably be kind of fun. So here's the extra credit. What I want you to do is I want to know, here's how the information is stored on vinyl. Actually, these little irregularities. How are these zeros and ones stored? How is a 0 or a 1 stored, or I don't know which way to phrase it. How is it contained on the CD? What on the CD represents a 0 and what represents a 1? How does that work? I'm going to put that credit on I want to say Blackboard so bad, on Canvas, and then I'll give you, I don't know, a week or so to do it. Look it up in your free time. You can look it up, read about it, and just write me a paragraph on how are these zeros and ones actually physically, what is a zero and what is a one on a CD? How does that work? That's the extra credit. I was going to write it, but you guys can just listen to the YouTube. Okay, I still got 5 minutes. Anybody have any other questions? I want to go over the practice problem. Any questions over anything I talked about? I got these lights on me. One day I'm gonna turn the camera around in the last day so you guys can see where I'm working. But it's really hot in here. I got to get a fan. Anybody have any questions?
I did have a real quick question.
Go ahead. I like questions.
For the register,
Yep.
how does it exactly know, or what communicates with the register to know when the byte size is completely filled up and when it should send the signal out? Or how does it know when the entire byte, whatever it's storing it in, fills up with information?
Okay, that's a good question, and it's a question that I don't know that I can answer in a short amount of time. But here's what I will say, because we're talking specifically about computers here. But let me give you another example of how that could happen. I will say inside of a digital device like a cell phone or a computer, timing is everything. So a lot of things work on time. They know the time that it takes something to happen. But here's another example that, and hopefully this answers your question. One way that is done using something called packets. I'm not saying inside of a computer they use packets, but they definitely use packets when you deal with computers talking to each other. So this may take a second. So if you got a second, I'll go through this. So one good example of that is a web page. So let's say right now we're communicating over the internet through a camera. What really is happening though is this: my camera is capturing analog information, is converting it to digital information, is going inside of my computer, and my computer is processing it. And by processing it, I mean I have some kind of application on there. On my thing, it's called the camera, right? But really it's a program, an app, just like Word or one of the apps on your phone, and it's doing stuff with the video. But ultimately, no matter what, if it's a video, if it's a sound, a color, no matter what, if you open up that machine and looked at it, all you would see is zeros and ones. You couldn't tell a video from a sound, from a color, from anything. It looks like zeros and ones. That's called machine language. And so you're right. If I'm sending that information out over the internet, which is what we're doing, how do I know where one begins and one ends? How do I know that? So one good example is to look at just moving digital information back and forth over a network. Now, if I have a computer connected to another computer, is pretty easy, right? Because I got a line and I can run over here and I can send that information back and forth. And that is the definition of a network. But the network I'm talking about is even bigger. The biggest network that we have on the planet is, of course, Ethernet. And you guys know I don't know the internet. What is the internet? I don't know if you know that or not. The internet, there's two things. There's the internet, which I call the network, and then there's the www, which is something else. They're not the same. The internet, if I draw a Venn diagram, the internet is like right here. But on the internet, I have other things. I got like the www, what is that? The World Wide Web, right? I got the www, World Wide Web. But there's other things on the internet. I have something called FTP. That's called File Transfer Protocol. When you upload something, you're not typing in www, you're doing a file transfer protocol. I got another one that does with email, but I don't remember the letters for it. Simple Transfer Protocol or something like that. The point I'm making is the internet is actually a network, and all the stuff that we use on the internet, like the World Wide Web, email, uploading files, that's actually software. So to answer your question is, what if I'm looking at a web page? I got this web page right here. And then remember, everything I'm talking about is zeros and ones. I have a web page with a person on it, but it's all zeros and ones. It's all digital. And let's say this is the web server. This is the server. And here I am over here. Here you are at home. Maybe that's me on the camera or something. I don't know. You want to link to that, so they call that the cloud. This is the internet. And here you are on your computer. Some kind of way you got to connect to the internet. So you go through a internet service provider. That's who you don't have a direct wire to the internet, right? You got a line, you connect to Cincinnati Bell, you connect to somebody, and then they connect through something else, and they connect through to the internet. So if I go www.webserver.com, some kind of way it finds this web server, and now I'm faced with the job of moving this whole web page, which really is a bunch of zeros and ones, all the way over to here, and reproduce it over here. So I got zeros and ones. So in this case, what they do is they use called a packet. A packet. And a packet, and this gets a little involved, but I won't go into too much detail here. A packet, basically, literally your web page, when you connect to a website, you get those zeros and ones from the website, your page is actually broken up into pieces and reassembled over here. And it's broken up using this idea of a packet. And what a packet is just a group of zeros and ones. So maybe this part of the web page, I'm coloring green, I don't know how big a packet is, I don't remember, but maybe that part right there represents one packet. A packet is a certain number of bits, a certain size. But that packet will carry the bits, and these bits represent whatever information is in that little area I just colored in. But also in that packet are other bits of information that we don't have access to. And the bits of information here, I have bits there, and I have bits here, are the information like, well, where does that belong in the web page? Is this the beginning or the end of it? There's other information in the digital information that when this comes over to your machine and is re-rendered, the information here can kind of say, hey, this is a start stop. Hey, this is where this goes. So I don't have a direct answer. Inside the computer, they have systems that a lot of it is just timing, but some of it they use information they have to store. Like, for instance, here's a good example. When you put something in memory, well, memory is just like, you don't go to one place and just put everything in one place. When you store, let's say Microsoft Word on a hard drive, it might not necessarily live in a continuous space on the memory. It might be in different places. When I want to pull up Word, how do I know where it begins? There's other information. There's somewhere else. There's other information tables. Keep track of things. We have to keep track of it, and not only in space but also in time. So that's a complicated question that we really can talk about and have a class on. But the information has to be there to tell when things happen in time and where things are. So hopefully that gives you kind of I know it won't give you a detailed understanding, but kind of a glimpse that at least understand that we're dealing with machines that, number one, are amazingly complicated, and number two, it's a wonder why they work at all. Because a computer has so much going on, things got to happen, but they got to happen at the right time, else the whole thing is messed up. So I don't know if I answered your question or not, but I tried. So hopefully you can get something out of that. We took a long time. Anybody else have any questions or comments? Okay, well, I'm going to keep working. The video, I've been going for an hour and 5 minutes. I'm going to keep working, and I want to go through that practice problem, but I also have an appointment at 2:20, so I'm going to go through it kind of quickly. But if you have that practice problem in front of you, I was going to write it on the board, but I don't have time. So please, while I'm putting it on the board, I want you to read it. And I'll read it in the camera, but I'm not going to write it because I don't have time to write it. But I'm going to draw the picture of it as best I can. So the problem statement, if you don't have it in front of you, well, hopefully you do, because I want you to work on this as I go through it. So it says, determine the total time required to transfer the 8 bits contained in the serial waveform A, which I don't have drawn yet. I'm going to draw that in just a second. Determine the total time required to transfer the 8 bits contained in the serial waveform A of figure 1-14 and indicate the sequence of bits. And it says the leftmost bit is the first bit to be transferred. They give you the clock speed of 100 kilohertz, and they tell you to use that as a reference. A clock is always used as a reference, so they didn't have to put that in there. The clock is the reference for everything in the computer or digital device. So they have this. This is my clock. Now what I want to do to get this right is the clock. I'm going to start right here. Here's T0, and the first click, the bit time, is right there. So what I'm going to do is just drop some parallel lines down like this. Now on the quiz, you need a ruler. If I give you something like this, you do exactly the same thing. Neatness counts here. Okay, so there's my clock. And then they have waveform A. So I'm just going to call this A. And it looks something like this. It starts here, and then goes up for 2 bit times, and then down, and then it goes over 1 bit time, and then down 5, goes over, up, over, down, and then it goes over like that. So I could just give you waveform A, and there's zeros and ones in waveform A, but without this clock as a reference, you wouldn't know if it was one big one, if it was 10-1, if it was what. You wouldn't know. So what do we have now? Well, it's pretty easy now to see that this is actually, this is a 1. That's a 1. That's a 0. That's a 1. 0. 1. And we got 2 zeros here. But in the problem statement, if I put this on a axis where I have my amplitude here, and that's time, if I set this on top of that axis, T0 is right here. So in time, what it's saying here, talk about the leftmost bit happens first. In time, you can see that that's true. You think of this as moving this way, but we think of things moving in time. So this is actually the first bit that's sent out, the first bit that's sent out. So the sequence I send out is if you were looking at this, so here's your eyeball, and you're looking at this, the waveform move, you just say this is A, B, C, D, E, and so forth. The first bit you will see go by is that one. So the first one would be the 1, I got the A by, and then the 1, and I got the B by, then the 0, and then so forth, moving that way. This is the actual one that goes down the line first. So there's a sequence of bits. The first one is a 1101010. Which one moves first? Well, that one, they tell you that, but you know that because T0 is over here. But they give you other information too. They tell you that the clock frequency is 100 kilohertz. So the clock frequency is 100 kilohertz. So F is 100 kilohertz. And what we want to know is, for the first part anyway, we got the sequence of bits. That was pretty easy. We want to know how long does it take to transfer all 8 bits? How long does it take to transfer all 8 bits? So I'll pause for a second. You guys think about that. You might already have the answer, but just hold on if you do. How would you work through that? How long does it take for all 8 bits? Now remember, we're sending these bits in serial. So this is like a serial in, serial out type situation. Or we're sending it bit by bit. So how long would it take to send? Well, all right, so they give us the frequency, so of course we want to get the period. Because the period, remember, the period defines the bit time. So the period, or just call it the bit time, because the only time we're going to even use the period in this class is when we refer to the bit time. So in your notes, that's the bit time. Capital T is the bit time, even though it's the period. But we can get the period by doing 1 over the frequency. So this is 1 over, let's say I got 100 times 10 to the third. Remember, frequency, even though it's in hertz, it's really inverse seconds, 1 over seconds. I like for units to work out. So if I do the math here, if I divide 1 by 100, I get 0.01 times 10 to the minus third. Now I can move this over 3 more places to the left, and what I would have is 10 times 10 to the minus 6, and that would be 10 microseconds. So that's kind of fast. Before we had milliseconds. So my bit time is 10 microseconds. So you can see how this starts to compound itself now. 10 microseconds. So the total time, I got 8 bits I'm sending. So I got to take the number of bits times the bit time. It's going to take 80 microseconds to move those bits if I do it in the serial way. But then the next question say, all right, instead of moving them in a serial fashion, what happens if I move them in parallel? I have a parallel in, parallel out shift register. How long will that take? It'll take 1 click of the clock. If I do it in parallel, it's 10 microseconds. So that is a big difference. But remember, there's a trade-off with everything. This is way faster. It's more expensive and it's more complicated. So, anytime when you're dealing with some kind of machine, it's always about balance and trade-off. So if you need speed and complexity doesn't matter, we want to handle things in parallel. But there's always other constraints like money and other constraints where you might be forced into a serial situation or somewhere in between the two. There's other ways that I can do this in between. Remember, we had serial in, serial out, parallel in, parallel out, and then there's a variety of ways in between. Serial in, parallel out. I can have parallel out, serial in. There's different ways. I might have said the same thing twice throughout. But there's a calculation, a practice problem, and honestly, guys, what I'll probably do is give you the same kind of thing on a quiz or something, and you'll be able to do it. But this kind of stuff where you have the your notes right there, I don't really know how to quiz you on because you got the answer right there. You can just copy it. But that's all I have. Anybody have anything they want to talk about? Any other questions or comments about the material? I had a good question last time, and I don't know who asked me the question about how do they know where things end and begin in the computer. That was an excellent question. Some of these people actually do PhD thesis on, and you can do a whole master degree program in something like some of the complexities of this. So it's more than what we want to get into, but it is interesting that you think of something complicated like a lot less complicated like your car. Well, my car, I don't know about your car. I drive an old car, so my car, I got like my oldest. I got some '60s cars, but I have a Well, I got what is that? A 2002 Ford, and when you stick the key in and you turn it, there's a lot going on. People get upset when their car doesn't start. It's amazing that it does start, because if you think about when you turn the key, all the things that's got to happen in the engine, the electrical, all the stuff that's got to happen, and not just happen, but happen at the right time for the right amount of time. It's a wonder your car starts at all. Well, take that car and multiply it by 1,000,000, and you got the complexity of a computer. You're moving around bits, and as the person pointed out, well, how do you know where one thing is? How does it know how long? How does it know a lot of stuff? It's amazing that it works at all. It's almost like magic, but it really isn't, because all this stuff was designed and created by man. And then to make it even more complex, now not only do we have these complicated systems, but now we have these systems that we want to make smaller and smaller and smaller. So it's becoming more and more amazing. And you guys are young enough to where you'll see, I don't know, you'll see some pretty amazing stuff come out. My days are, I'm getting older, so my days are starting to be numbered, but it's really interesting to see. I've lived long enough to see a lot of this stuff go from, I remember they call it core magnetic memory, and then what we have now. Or I mentioned the story about the computer I bought in 1998 and what you guys use now. You have the same amount of power probably in your cell phone that I had on my whole PC. So it's pretty amazing, but I don't want to go off on too many tangents. If you guys have any other questions, I'll take them. If not, I will see you. I'm sure I'm going to see you. Look, the next video is a PowerPoint, so we won't meet for that. Wednesday, I'll have to let you know if we're going to meet or not. It may just be a recording. If it's just a PowerPoint, I'm not going to read the PowerPoint to you. I'll just make a video and you can watch it at your leisure. And I'll put up an announcement on when the next time we have to meet is, which will be definitely Friday, because there'll be a quiz. Anybody have any questions or comments before I sign off? Well, guys, thank you for hanging around after class, and have a great rest of the day. And I will see you guys. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. For the example problem, for B, did you explain the total time in parallel? I didn't. Is that the 8?
Yeah. So if I send it bit by bit, the bit time right here, the bit time, I guess this blue shows up. The bit time right here, we calculate it to be this. So 1 bit time is 10 microseconds. It's a bit time. So I got 8 bits, so it's going to be 8 times 10, 80 microseconds if they're in serial in, serial out, right? But in parallel, what I have is this. I got all those bits. I got a 1, a 1, a 0, a 1, a 0, a 1, a 0, and a 0. I got all those bits just sitting there inside this register, and in the 10 microseconds, they can move through just on the first click of the clock. So what I got was, for an answer, 80 microseconds if I do it in serial, but only 10 microseconds if I do it in parallel. In parallel, whatever you do in parallel is always equal to 1 bit time. So on the quiz, if I say, all right, what if I do if I transfer this in a parallel fashion, just figure out the bit time, whatever that is. That's your answer for parallel. If it's a serial type situation I give you, figure out the bit time, multiply that by the number of bits. Here we had 8 bits, so I multiplied that bit time by 8, and that's how I got to 80 microseconds. And I will give you one of these on the quiz, so you do want to know that. So that is a good question that you asked. Does that make sense to everybody, or do you have other questions?
No, that was all. I was just kind of confused about that part.
Okay, buddy. Well, you guys have a nice one. It's supposed to rain some more, so stay safe, stay dry. See you guys soon. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
You too. Thank you.